Hello everybody, can you hear me? This is Brooke and I am currently sitting in my house just talking into my phone, which is kind of funny because I've never done this before, so I don't know if you can hear me, but go ahead and just leave me a comment or type something to let me know that you can hear me. And I have to say that I am so grateful that you guys are here joining me for this because I sort of felt like I was in a dream this morning when I was getting ready and when you guys started logging on and talking. It's like my dream come true to have a community around me and to have somebody to talk to and to have somebody to share what I do with. So I'm just so excited and so happy. So let's get started. And I want to start off by saying that this whole entire webinar was made possible by X-Rite Photo. So big thank you to them. And I believe they'll be doing a giveaway soon as well. So definitely stay on for that. And so I just want to jump right in, and I want to tell you a little bit about, just a little bit about my process, a little bit about what I do, how I came to be here. And so it all started for me. I started photography about 6 years ago, and when I started photography, it was for me much more a way of telling stories than anything else. I was never really interested in taking portraits of people. I was never interested in nature photography, and as a result, I love all of those things now. It's sort of like my favorite thing is to watch people do something that I can't do or that I don't know how to do. But my sort of form of storytelling is to tell stories that live inside me and that I'm fascinated by, that I think are a little bit different from other people. So that is what I personally love to do. And I have sort of a confession to make, I guess, because when I started photography, I didn't know anything about it. Like, so little that I would go online and look at pictures and I didn't know how they were taken. I had no idea if they were paintings or photographs. I was just lost. And I always thought that photography had to be a certain thing. And I don't know if you guys ever had this experience with specifically fine art photography, but when I started, I thought that fine art photography had to be black and white. I thought it had to be monochrome. I thought that it had to be nude. Like I had all of these certain expectations of what fine art photography was. And because of those expectations, I started creating in a certain way. Now, I was creating with my vision 100%, and yet when I would get into Photoshop, I would quickly desaturate all of my photos, and I was under the impression that in order to make art, or, you know, capital A in quotes art, I had to essentially create desaturated black and white sepia monotoned images. And in a lot of ways, my style has come to be very much about color. It has to do a lot less with desaturating my images and a lot more about what specific color I put into my images. So that's why I wanted to talk about that today, because color is such a hugely important thing for me. And as we go on, as we sort of go through this presentation, I want you to know that you can ask absolutely anything that you want. It doesn't have to be about color. It doesn't have to be about Photoshop. It can be personal. It could be business related, whatever you might want. I am totally here for you for the next 30 minutes or so. So please feel free to ask whatever you want, and maybe I'll jump in there and ask you guys some questions too. And so let's just get started then with the slideshow here. So we're talking about the process behind visual storytelling. And for me, there is really quite a process. It's not always just a matter of, okay, what might look good for this photo? I have sort of like a formula that I use for most of my images, and that formula sort of carries on from one image to another. And of course, it changes slightly based on what the image needs, but largely I've got a process. So let's talk a little bit about that process. And the first thing that I do, whether it's creating a new image or analyzing somebody else's image, is to ask myself how color relates to storytelling. I want to know right off the bat how somebody else might interpret a color, and I want to know how I interpret that color. Now, we all might have different associations with certain colors. So you might have a certain meaning that goes along with red, whereas I might think something completely different. So I want to go through that now, and I want to ask you guys a quick question. And so you'll see a little poll up on your screen, hopefully here. And I want to know, out of these colors, which makes you feel calm? And this is just you personally. So out of the colors red, blue, orange, and pink, which one of those would you say makes you feel the most calm or soothed or sort of in a state of relaxation? Now, there's a certain answer here that might be more socially acceptable, something that most people might say, but it's still a personal experience, and it's really interesting to study how other people see color. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the poll results here, and we're going to see exactly what you guys think. So as you can see, we've got a few votes for red, orange, and pink, but the vast majority of people chose blue. And that's because of how we associate blue visually in our everyday lives and how that color makes us feel. So when we think of blue, we think of the sky. We think of the ocean, maybe. We think of things that, in general, make us feel happy and calm and relieved. And so when I'm using blue in an image, it's very, very often to emulate that same feeling. So if you think about color in that way, that it's going to make somebody feel something depending on the hue and the tone that you choose, then you can more accurately pair whatever color it is that you're working with to the image that you're creating. So let's go ahead and do this one more time. If you had to pick a color that represents insanity, what would that be? Orange, black, purple, white. This is kind of a tricky one. I'm actually not certain what I would say. I'm going to vote. Okay. So hopefully that gives you enough time to choose. And you see now this one is really interesting because while fewer people chose white, we have kind of an even spread between orange, black, and purple. Now, my associations with those three colors, and this is why I chose them to put on here, is because they remind me of Halloween, because they remind me of this kind of, creepy holiday. Now, orange and black are sort of typical prison colors, and so it makes a lot of sense that we would feel insanity based on these colors. Now, I have one more. And I want to know what color to you represents innocence and purity. There's turquoise, yellow, white, and brown. And I think that for this one, there is a very obvious, very specific visual that might come to your mind when you're thinking about innocence and purity. And that's probably a wedding, depending on what culture you're in. So if you think about a bride, then you think that she's probably going to be wearing a white dress. And so you see in the results that a vast majority of people chose white because innocence and purity is culturally very often associated with the color white. So all of these things are just to prove that we have certain associations about certain colors. So when you use a certain color in a context that isn't appropriate, that can really throw somebody through a loop. And that's not to say don't do that, but that is to say that be aware of how you're doing it, because when you are, then you can more easily control people's emotions. That sounds really bad, control people's emotions. But, to me, it's sort of like, you can either have control or you don't have control. And I would much rather know what I'm doing to somebody, or at least have a really good idea of it, and then I can better spread my message. Okay. Now, for me, color has these three things that go with it. It has emotion in it, so a certain color will elicit a certain emotion. For example, red might elicit the emotion of passion or love. Associations. So that same color red might have certain things that you personally think about when you think about the color red. So now at this point in my life, when I think of the color red, I think of dresses. But before I started photography, if I thought about the color red, I would think about my aunt because that's her favorite color. So we all have different things that we associate. And then there are different meanings. So meanings could be, let's see, there's somebody dressed in red, and so we see that person as being powerful because red has this sort of bold, powerful feeling to it. So those are sort of three ways that I associate color. Now, if we move on, then there are three more ways that we need to think about color, not just how it makes us feel, but further than that, the overall color tone is really important. So it's really easy to sort of look at a picture and, like, for example, the picture that's in this slide and say, oh, well, the color's purple. That's the color that we see here. And it is, but there's also an overall color toning happening, and that's sort of a warm yellowish hue that's over everything. So there's the overall color tone, the objects that are colored certain ways within a picture, and then contrasting colors. Now, when I say contrasting colors, that is the foundation on which color theory is built for me, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And also, by the way, do send in questions as we go if you have any, and at the very end, I will be answering questions in a Q&A format, so don't feel like I'm ignoring you, because I swear I'm not. I just can't look two places at once. Okay, so moving on to the next slide here. Now, I have a very personal and intimate relationship with my color signature. So what is a color signature? Now, to me, a color signature is a way to make your work recognizable through color. It's a set of colors that you might use frequently. It's a set of color patterns that perhaps you gravitate towards. Maybe it's maybe an object in an image that you always color a certain way. So there are a lot of different ways in which you can give your images a color signature. And it's kind of funny because I have a lot of color signatures in my work, and we'll be talking about each of those. And yet still, on a regular basis, I hear from people who say to me, I know your work because of the colors. And I mean, if you look at this picture of the girl with the umbrella, well, that's a very different color than the last slide that we just looked at with the purple and the leaves all around. They're very different colors, and yet it's very likely that somebody will link those two pictures together. So the question is why? What is it about these pictures that links together even though they don't necessarily match? So this is my color signature. My color signature is sort of these four main things. The colors are usually rich. In this picture that you're looking at right now, it's sort of a duller picture, and yet that that yellow color that you see is still a very rich yellow. It's deep, it's darker, it has that golden sheen to it, and because of that, this yellow is rich, as opposed to, say, pastel. If this were a pastel colored dress, then I might look like an Easter egg, but I don't, hopefully. So instead, it's rich. There's usually one main color in the picture, and in this case, it's yellow. So I try very, very hard to have one or maybe two colors that really stand out in an image as being the main color in the picture. The other thing that I do is that I make a choice, warm or cool. And if I can choose warm or cool, then I know that I have created a certain type of picture based on how I want the viewer to feel. And then earthy. So I will almost never use neon colors, for example. Even if I'm creating rich color in my image, it still has an earthy vibe to it, where the background maybe is desaturated and has more of a brown hue to it. Maybe the color that's being used overall as a toning is sort of an earthy hue, whereas a lot of other artists will use just really, really bright poppy colors. And I think that that's fabulous. I just happen to not do it. And so that's my color signature. So what I want to know from you guys is, do you have a color signature? Do you feel like you have a certain toning happening in your images that would allow somebody to say, yes, I know that this is so-and-so's picture, or I know this whole portfolio belongs to whoever it is that you are answering this question? Do you have a color signature? So think about that for just a second and go ahead and answer that poll. Because I believe that color signatures are one of the most important things, even if it's a lack of color in your signature, and that's okay too. Okay, So we have about 30% saying yes and about 70% saying no. And so that is exactly what we're going to try to work on right now, is getting a color signature. Now there's no way for me to say to you, okay, this is your color signature. Go ahead and do this, 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 and this, and you'll be good to go. Obviously, I can't do that. And that's unfortunate, because if there was somebody out there who could just say, hey, this is what you have to do, then, you know, we'd probably all be in better shape, but it'd be a lot less fun. So if you do have a color signature, do you think that it can improve? And if you don't, do you think you can find one? Now, I personally think that I do have a color signature, but I am always working on improving that. And a good way of doing that is to really study it, to figure out what colors you're using, why you're using those colors, how you're using those colors. And when we start into the live editing section today, I'm going to show you a pretty good example of how I'm trying to expand and study my color signature. So as usual, I'm talking way, way too much, and so let's just keep moving on here. Now, these are just some examples of my images and how I categorize them with color. So we have this image here with the leaves on my head, and I wrote warm, earthy, and muted. And those three descriptive words, which you could apply to this image based on the color toning, makes me think of autumn, of the fall. It makes me think of leaves falling, and of course it does because there are leaves on my head. But even if there weren't, this has that certain almost dead but beautiful feeling that the autumn has. And then we have this image, which is very different. It's rich, it's vibrant, and it's dark. And all of those things make me think of distress. When I put a rich color like red, and it's so vibrant, and it's so dark in the background, that makes me sort of have a sense of uneasiness, and that makes me think of distress. And then we have one more here. Now, this one is different than the others. It's not a warm image, it's a cool image. It has even toning. There's no really one color that stands out in this image. And it even has a sort of pastel look to it. And all of those things make me feel calm when I look at this image. There's no pose that's crazy, that's like reaching, gasping for air, anything like that. It's just a cool, calm, collected image. And now if we move on from that, I want to talk very briefly about color as symbol. Because color as symbol can sort of say a lot of things to us depending on what we're looking at. So there are two ways, as I mentioned before, that I like to look at color. First, whether I'm looking at my own image or somebody else's, I am looking at selective coloring versus overall toning. Now, if you look at this image with the bird's nest, there is certainly an overall color tone happening here. It is very, very yellow. And yet, there's one thing in this image that has been selectively colored, which is the dress. So when I shot this, that dress was blue, but it was a very, very light blue. And when I started adding that yellow tone over everything and desaturating a little bit, that dress started blending into the field. So I went in and I selected all around that dress, and I ended up selectively coloring that dress to be blue. That dress then became a symbol for a bird, a blue jay, someone who's fallen from the nest. If that dress had not been blue, then it might not have such a strong color symbol. In the next slide, we have the same thing, same example, selective color toning versus overall color toning. Now here we have a couple of different colors, and that's why I put this in here, because this is a great example of where I'm not using only one color to be the main color in the image. So we've got purple grass, we have a red dress, and we have these sort of yellow walls. And because of all three of those colors together, I could say that this image has overall color toning as well as selective color toning. And finally, on the last example of this, we have color as symbol in that this is pretty much just overall color toning. Now, the butterflies that I used were already blue, so I didn't have to selectively color tone that, which means that it already had a color tone to it. So I've got the yellow atmosphere, and I've got the blue butterflies. And for me, yellow can be a symbol of sort of something calm if it's used the right way, but it can also be a little bit distressing. So that blue butterfly that I chose very carefully really, really helped me to feel like I was adding something into this picture that wasn't so dark. There's also sort of an argument to be made for no color at all or very, very little color. I don't do that very often in my work. So when I go ahead and desaturate an image, then I know it's for a good cause. I know that I'm doing that because I feel that I really need to, that the image calls for it. In this case, by having no real color in the image except for a dull yellow overtone, that creates more of a sense of nature in the picture, and that was something that I was going for. So far we've talked about overall color toning, selective color toning, how we relate to colors in an image, and how we relate to having no color in an image. And all of those things are so important because we need to understand how we feel toward color if we're going to put it in our work in a meaningful way. And that brings me to the next slide here, which is all about a series. So I'm curious, you guys can just leave some comments in the Q&A. How many of you guys work in series very often? I personally don't do it very often, mostly because I seem to not have the attention span to do it. I'm sure that you guys know what I'm talking about. You have this great idea and you write out all the ideas and then you start it and then like by, I don't know, image 3 or 4, you're like, I'm bored. I'm not going to do this anymore. Well, I do that a lot, so I don't know if you do too, but I definitely do. And the benefit that I had to creating this particular series was that it was all done in one day. So I could just go from one image to the next and get it all done real fast, and so I had a series. Now, obviously, there's a certain color happening in this series that links it together, and that's blue. In every single image, there is something blue except for the last one, and that's the last image in the series here. So it's interesting how we use color because suddenly that final image is completely separated from the series. You can tell that it still goes together based on the lighting and the location, and that's good for connecting a series. But you know that something a little bit different is happening here based on the red floor, which looks very sinister, the fact that the character's wearing a black dress. That says something very different from the white and yellow hues that you've been seeing in the rest of the series. All right, now I told you that we were going to talk more about opposites, coloring images in opposites. This is, oh gosh, I can't even stress it enough how important it is to me to color my images in opposites. So this is what I mean. Now I don't mean what you see on the screen right now, which is that literally half of this image is red and the other half is purple. I don't mean that, but this is what I do mean. Highlights versus shadows, background versus foreground, and warm versus cool. In every single image that I do, I make these distinctions. I separate the highlights from the shadows. I separate the background from the foreground, and I figure out if it needs to be a warm or cool image or both. So when I was creating this image, I was thinking, okay, the highlights, should they be a different color from the shadows? Now that doesn't mean that the midtones won't sort of meet in the middle, because they will, and that makes it sort of connect from one spectrum to the other. But I had to make a decision. Are the highlights going to be warm or are they going to be cool? Are the shadows going to be warm or are they going to be cool? And then same thing for the background versus the foreground. Now we'll talk about this in a second as well, but when I do background and foreground coloring, I'm not only thinking, should it be a different color, but does it need to be desaturated more than the foreground? Does the foreground need to stand out more than the background? And warm versus cool is a little bit more obvious. So let's move on to this example here. I've got this image, a self-portrait that I took, and when I was editing this image, I chose very specifically a blue dress. And it was my goal when I took this picture to make the background blue like my dress. I was going to leave my skin tone yellow and the books yellow, and it was going to be this sort of blue background, blue dress, yellow skin, yellow books, and that was going to be my color sort of coding of this image. But I got in there and I made the background blue, and I realized very quickly that my dress just sort of blended in too much with the background. And so I changed my mind and I made it yellow. You can see this comparison now if we go back to highlights versus shadows. So this is a perfect example of how if I don't think in terms of highlights and shadows, how my image could have ended up. Now, I'm not going to say that the one on the right is bad necessarily. It's just not how I wanted it. So if I decide, I'm going into Photoshop, I've got my raw image, and I decide that it needs a yellow tone, I am almost never going to pull from the midtones and make that image yellow. Because if I do, then we have this slight problem then of making this sort of a muddy color because we're not separating the highlights and the shadows. So in the image on the left, that's what I ended up going with. And in that image, I only colored the highlights yellow. And instead, I went blue with the shadows. And that softened the image a lot and allowed it to not be so muddy like you see on the right. So in the next example here, we've got background versus foreground. In the foreground, we have a lot of color. That's where our focus is. That's where our subject is. But then in the background, there's really nothing of importance there. It's just a forest. So I added a little bit of purple just to sort of bring in some color there. But I selected that background and I actually desaturated it so that it had less color. And by desaturating it, I allowed the subject to stand out even more without having to oversaturate the foreground. Now with my work, I have kind of a problem with separating the foreground and the background because of how I shoot. I shoot on a tripod, on a prime lens, and I'm not shooting with any lights. So because I'm not shooting with lights, I don't have anything to make my subject stand out. Everything is lit completely evenly. Sometimes there's naturally color in the background that I don't want there. So the way that I work with that is to selectively brighten up my subject, add more color to that region so that your eye is drawn there first, and take color away from the background. So here we have an example of warm versus cool. And the image on the left clearly is a cool image, and it calls for that because there's snow, there's a blue room, there's a blue cloak, and because of all of those elements, it just didn't make sense to make this a warm image. I wanted you to look at it and think cold. Now, whereas the one on the right, we have a very warm image because of the nature of what I was trying to do. I wanted it to look like wildfire, and because of that, I needed red and yellow and orange and all of those tones to go into this picture. So this is kind of my theory in color toning. I have one main color and one overall tone. And when I have one main color and one overall tone, then that very simply allows me to focus in on a color that's going to be the symbol and then add a color overall in the image to make it cohesive. Because cohesion is, in my opinion, the most important thing when coloring an image so that it doesn't look like each individual element doesn't go with the other one. So if I'm going really, really fast through this, which I recognize that I am, all of these slides will be available to you for download. So just don't worry about that. It's going to be there. So that's going to be available for you, as well as a color texture packet that I have available to download as well. Okay, so these are the two questions that I answer for myself every single time I color an image. The first one is, which color is going to feature in my image? Which color is going to be the color that I feel needs to pop the most? And then what color tone will my images have? So here are some different techniques for changing colors. And I'm going to go through this really fast because we're about to edit in Photoshop. But these are some of my favorite ways of coloring an image. The first one, surprisingly, not in Photoshop, is to choose a neutral location. Choose a space that doesn't have a lot of color naturally. Or if your color signature means a lot of color, then choose a space that has a lot of color. Whatever you need to set the tone for your image, that's what you should be doing. So, for example, in these two images, they were both shot in Iceland this year. And Iceland was great because it had all these amazing natural locations, where on one half we have the sort of black rock flat landscape with the white sky. On the other side, we have just neutral rocks with water and some really light colored moss. So I was able to then add the color in that I wanted into this picture, and it didn't look muddy because I had a neutral location. Replace color is a tool that I use all the time, so we're going to go through that a little bit. selective coloring, which is selecting whatever you want to be colored and then using something like curves or levels or something like that to add color. And coloring with texture is something that I've never talked about before, but something that I started doing recently. So we're going to talk about that as well. A couple little points that I want to make here is that I never studied art before. So if I'm saying things that don't sound right, they might not be. I don't know. I don't know anything. But all I know is what I have taught myself in Photoshop. So I go into Photoshop all the time. I try different color combinations. I let them look awful, and then I see how I can fix them. And I learned by practicing tools in Photoshop. So if you don't fundamentally understand why something looks good, then try different things, because it's very likely that you'll understand why something looks bad. And really, the whole thing here is asking yourself why. Why does it look good? Why does it look bad? What exactly is it that makes it look so good? And then try to make that picture look bad. Bring a picture in that you think looks awesome and try adding different colors to see what makes it look worse. Then you know what is the most important thing happening in the color in that image. One more thing that I want to note here is that if you guys do have any questions about business and printing colors, because that is, of course, a huge, huge part of what I do, given that I sell my prints to make a living, really. I always have to make sure that my colors are accurate when I print. I had a really fortunate situation with the printer that I've used over the years in that he just knows my work. So he knows that I don't want certain colors in my images, and I don't mean for something to print a certain way sometimes. But on average, at least a few times a year, I would have a giant print made and have to remake it because the color was off. And sometimes I'd have to pay for that. So I started using X-Rite, and that is who is sponsoring the event right now, and I gotta say I'm in love with them. So I calibrate my monitor, and I didn't used to. I just started this year, and it's made a huge difference because I haven't had one single print go back to the drawing board yet. All right, so getting into some Photoshop here. Now, again, you're gonna get this slide, so don't, I'm going to skip through it pretty quickly here, but this is in general what my curves boxes looks like. So I've got the curves in terms of the RGB, which is highlight, shadow, midtone, and that is a typical curve for me. So what you're seeing here in all of these boxes with the blue curve, the red curve, the green curve, that is very, very typical for me in terms of how I start out coloring overall all of my images. I skew the shadows to be gray, I make the highlights a little bit duller, and I add a little bit of contrast in the midtones. From there, I almost always add yellow to my highlights and blue to my shadows. I almost always add red to my highlights, and I almost always add magenta to my shadows. I will almost never add green to a picture. That is the one thing that I tend to stay away from, but I'm going to show you an example here in a second where that is not true. My other favorite tool in Photoshop is Replace Color, and that's the one that you see on the left. And we're going to go over that in a moment. And that's just a way of selectively changing colors, as is Selective Color, also in Image Adjustments, where you'll find Replace Color, Selective Color, and Photo Filter. So Selective Color is a way to isolate a certain color in the image and then change that color. And then Photo Filter is going to add sort of a hue, whatever hue you want, over the whole entire image. Lastly, this is an example of coloring with texture and masking, because you have to erase the texture in certain parts to be able to color with it. So very often I will add a texture over my image, usually a black and white texture, almost always. And then I start to color that texture. So in this case, I colored it yellow, and that's what you see on the right, is wherever the texture's hitting, that's where the color is being applied. And then finally here we have just a few different examples of that. So here we have all different colors, red, yellow, green, blue. And so I colored my images based on the texture that I was using. Now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys. And I'm going to go into Photoshop now. So one second while I load that. It's just going to take a moment. And almost there. There we go. So hopefully you guys can see the live stream that I have happening here. And let's dive right in. So I am editing in Photoshop CS6, as you guys can see at the top of the screen. And this is a picture that I haven't released yet, so if you guys have critique for me, totally feel free. I am so open to that. But I just started working on this image about a month ago, and it didn't really feel right. So I kept editing it, and the thing that I noticed wasn't right about the picture was the color. And once I started paying more attention to the colors, things started coming together for me. You'll notice something in this image, which is that the top third of the image is sort of a warm yellow, orange, red hue. And then as we move down the image into the center part, we're adding blue into the mix. So there's still that red hue over it, and yet the ocean is blue. And then if we go under the water line, this is the first time in the image where we do not have a red tone happening. So that red has gone into the opposite category of color, which is cyan, and that's helping to distinguish between underneath the water and above the water. I personally love having these different elements in a picture that can sort of speak to different ways that we're going to interpret it. I also love balance in a picture with color, so that we have three sections of this picture that are sort of equally divided with three different color tones makes me very excited. And that's what I mean when I say that I'm working really, really hard to try to figure out how to create a more advanced color signature in my work. So let's move on to this image real quick here. I just started editing this last night actually, and thought that it would be a really good example of an image that already has a color tone. I shot this image at, gosh, it must have been 1 a.m. in Iceland. So it was dark. It wasn't totally dark, but it was dark. It already had this blue cast over it, and all I've done to this picture so far is brighten up this section of the picture and make the dress a little bit lighter. I haven't done anything else. The ice, the sky, everything was that color. Now, if I wanted to change the color of this, I could to a certain extent, but do I want to? Probably not, because there's ice in this picture. She's sort of like the ice queen. Hi, Lika, I know that you're watching, and I love you. And so I know that I want to keep the color signature as a cool blue hue here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go to my image adjustments curves, which is what I use all the time. And if I wanted to make this image warmer, I absolutely could. And all I have to do is go to my drop-down menu and figure out what colors are already present in my image and then find the opposites. I know that there is blue in this image because I'd be crazy if I thought that there wasn't. So I'm going to choose blue. And I know that by pulling up on my graph, I'm going to add more blue to this image, which I don't want to do. So I'm just going to do the opposite, and I'm going to make it yellow. And now what color do I see? Sort of a greenish cyan color. So if I have a greenish cyan color, then I need to go to red and add red, because the opposite of red, if I pull down here, is cyan. So if I add red, then I'm starting to add more color red to that image. So you'll see that toning happening. And then if I go into green, which is the other color here, then I can make it a little bit more magenta. Now, yes, we have problems because the dress is really, really colored, her back is really red, and this is where masking comes in. So we'll get into that in just a second. So to look at this third image that I have up, which we saw a little bit earlier, I want to go through the 10 different steps that I would personally take to color this image. I am way over time, and I am so aware of that, but if you guys will stick with me, I'm just going to run through this. All right, so I'm going into image adjustments, and this is my best friend, image adjustments. My favorite thing in the whole wide world. I love it to death. So I'm going into image adjustments, and the first thing that we can talk about, if we just start at the bottom, let's say, is match color. Now, I don't talk about match color very often, but that doesn't mean that it's not worth talking about. Match color is great for me because it has this color slider where it says color intensity. Have you guys noticed when you want to add sort of a sepia tone to your images that you tend to, or at least I do, I tend to desaturate my images and then add a little bit of color back into it? But with color intensity and match color, it's very, very simply a way to desaturate a lot of the colors in your image while keeping that sort of warm sepia hue over your image by taking that color intensity slider down. You can do the same thing going up. You can add more color to your image, and it doesn't work in the exact same way that that hue saturation will. So you can just take that down and play with that a little bit. So that's one. The next thing that I want to show you is, again, in image adjustments, and this time it's photo filter. So by choosing photo filter, I can now decide what color I want to add as an overall hue to my image. I sometimes use this as a practical application, but a lot of the times I just use this so that I can figure out just the basic color tone so I can see what it looks like. So let's say we want to go in the opposite direction here, and let's do underwater. Okay, so we've added an underwater photo filter. I can take that density up, see how it looks. We can just try all sorts of different things here, and I can get a sense of what I want this image to look like. So that's photo filter. The next one we've already talked about briefly is curves, image adjustments curves. Curves, we've already talked, so I'm not going to go through this too much. Red, green, and blue are your color channels, and all you have to do is know the opposites. So know that there's red and cyan, for example, but also understand that the top part of the graph are your highlights and the bottom are your shadows. So if I want to add red to my highlights, I'm simply going to pull up in that area. If I want to add cyan to my shadows, I'll pull down in that area. You can see this is a very extreme example, but it allows for a much more dynamic color range. So the next one that I want to talk about is hue saturation. Hue saturation is one that I use mostly for the saturation portion, usually taking it down or maybe a little bit up. So I usually take my saturation down. What I don't usually do these days is play with the hue overall, because then you have skin tones changing color pretty drastically sometimes, and that's not a pretty thing. But the other one is lightness, so sometimes if I need to just make everything overall darker, I can do it that way. However, I typically reserve the lightness and the hue for selective color changes, where I've selected something, I've made a color change selectively to an object, and then I can play with lightness and hue. Okay, the next one is replace color. Image adjustments again, replace color. So replace color works really simply. It gives you this little black and white graph, and if you have this little black and white graph that pops up, that means that you're on selection, and if it is the full image, then you're on image. So you don't necessarily want to be on image if you want to make sense of this graph. Now you have an eyedropper tool, so let's just say I want to change red. I've clicked the color red in my image. The fuzziness is already up to 200. If that were down, you'd be selecting less and less and less. Now let's say it's all the way up, but you want to select more of a tonal range. You can choose the eyedropper tool with the plus sign, choose another bit of red in the image, and then you have more selected where you can then adjust that fuzziness slider. Now with the hue down here, I can go ahead and change that to whatever color I want. You can see where it's missed some at the bottom, and that's okay, because you can either do the eyedropper tool to add it, or you can simply go in and add it in a different selection. So I'm going to cancel that. Now selective color is the next one that I want to talk about. So image adjustments, selective color. And selective color works pretty well, but I would argue that replace color works a lot better. So you have this color drop-down menu, red, yellow, green, and it says reds, yellows, greens, and things like that with a plural, because it's saying that I'm going to pick up anything that has a red hue to it, and I'm going to change that thing. So you have a little bit less control. So I'm going to keep it on red, and we know that from curves that the opposite of red is cyan. So I'm going to go ahead with cyan, and let's just say we want to take away the red. I'm going to pull up on that cyan, and it's going to start to take away some of the red. I could also pull the other way and add more red to it. So maybe the magenta, we can add green instead of magenta, and that's really going to take away that red. And now we can just sort of play with all the other sliders and see what they do. So it works pretty well when you have a really bold color that stands out in the image. All right, so one other thing that I wanted to show here is if I go down here and make, in my layers palette, if I make a blank layer, then I can go ahead and fill that blank layer in with whatever I want. So let's choose a color. And I'm going to make this sort of like a sunset-y kind of look. So I've chosen this orangey yellow color. And I'm going to choose my paintbrush tool, or paint bucket tool, sorry, and just click. So now I've made just a big yellow-orange square. All right, that's not exactly what we want because that looks ridiculous. So let's go ahead and create a layer mask on that. And with the brush tool, oh dear, I have a very large brush. I'm going to make that brush pretty big, and I'm going to erase it where we don't want it, just like this. Now I can lower the opacity on my brush, and by the way, if I right-click, that's a very fuzzy brush, meaning it's at 0% hardness. So I'll take the opacity down on my brush, and I can erase just a little bit more. Okay, so we've got some yellow in the corner, and this is meant to be a little bit of like a light flare, just something to add sort of a sunny disposition to the image. So if I click back on that yellow square, I can go to my drop-down menu here in Layers for where it says Normal. I could choose Lighten, let's say, and that's going to add sort of a luminance to it, whereas before it was just yellow. So now it's sort of blending in a little bit, and at this point I can just take that opacity down like that. And if I take that on and off, you can see that it's adding just a little bit of light, a little bit of color in the corner of the image. So that's one way that I like to add color in specific places to my pictures. Okay, now another thing that I would do here is I might create an adjustment layer, a black and white adjustment layer. And you can see that this has made my whole image black and white. So I'm just going to X out of there. And on the layer mask that's already been created, I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, but take the opacity all the way up. And I am just literally painting back in that color that I want in the foreground. So this is a great example of coloring an image in the foreground versus the background. Now the background's just completely black and white now, so I'm going to take the opacity on that layer down. But you can see how we're dulling the background and really making the subject stand out by really paying attention to the background and the foreground. All right, so one other thing that I can't show you because I'm positive my computer will crash is lighting effects. So if you wanted to go to lighting effects, that'll be in Filter. Oops, let me click on the actual layer here. Filter, Render, Lighting Effects. And that's going to allow you to play with the lighting, but also there will be little boxes that show you the color. So usually it'll default to white, but whatever your color is, you can change that to whatever you want, and whatever light you're adding to your image will have a certain color tone. Very, very important for me. Now the final thing that I want to show you in terms of how to change color is with this colored texture that I have here. So I've got a colored texture, and this happens to be a blue one, and this is one that you will receive in the download. So I'm going to choose my Move tool, and you could do this by copying and pasting this image. And I'm just taking this over to, let's say, our blue image. Now I'm working on a much smaller version of this picture due to the fact that my computer will crash. So I'm just going to make my texture a little bit smaller there. And I've got a texture. So now if I want to blend this texture, again with that normal drop-down menu where it defaults to normal in the Layers palette, you can choose Soft Light or any that you prefer, and that's going to add an overall color tone to your image. Now I have, I'll show you an image that is not finished, so please don't judge me. I'm doing this on a whim. But I'm going to open up this image. Now this is one that I recently did this with. I only colored this whole picture with textures. So I used various colored textures in the background of the image on the wall, and that way I could sort of erase it off of my subject while coloring the background, and that was really, really helpful for me. So those are all of the ways that I adjust color and think about color when I'm editing a picture in Photoshop. And the most important points to that would be the background versus the foreground, the highlights versus the shadows, and just thinking about the overall color tone after you've considered if anything needs to have a certain color within the image. So I'm going to come over back here. I'm going to stop my screen sharing. If I can, I don't even know. Oh, there we go. And hop back into the presentation. So that is essentially what we've got going on there then in Photoshop with color, all of that goodness. So I think that we can take questions now. And I'm just going to hop right in there if you guys can still hear me and everything's good and I didn't make anything crash when I got out of my screen sharing. Okay, so let's go ahead and go through some of these questions. Okay, so let's see. We've got, let me see what's still relevant because I think that we have sort of covered some of this stuff. Okay, so a question about printing. We'll just go in order that they were received here. Which paper canvas do you typically print your art on, gloss or luster or matte? So I print all of my work on a matte paper. It's a thick fine art matte paper. It's called Elegance Velvet. So let me just go ahead and write that out here. Elegance Velvet fine art paper from Breathing Color. That is the paper that I have always used, that I continue to use. I do not print on canvas. I have printed on canvas, but I found that they just damage too easily. They pretty much all of them have some sort of irreparable damage that I had to not be able to sell them because of that. And they just didn't sell as well. So I switched over to fine art paper and haven't really looked back since then. Let's see. Do you work exclusively in Photoshop for your workflow? Yes, I do. And that isn't to say that, you know, Lightroom isn't good or something like that, but I just never had a real need for it because I'm only editing one image at a time. So whereas somebody else might be editing a whole wedding or a whole portrait session or, you know, something where you have a lot more images that you're trying to cull and you're trying to edit, I never had a use for Lightroom in that way. And so I use Bridge to sort through my images, and I use Photoshop to basically to do everything. Yeah, I have used GIMP before. GIMP is a free sort of version of Photoshop, I guess, and I'm able to do everything that I do in Photoshop in GIMP. However, I'm very, very used to Photoshop, and I like the way that it runs. So that has become something that I really sort of look forward to. Okay. Brooke, I took art 4 years in high school. One of them was art honors, and I majored in photography for a time, and I still feel like I don't know anything. No, that's not good. That's not what I want to hear, although it's not the end of the world, because the problem with school is that you have to do certain things in your curriculum. I went to Temple University, and I studied filmmaking and English. And when I got out of school, and this was no fault of the school by any means, but when I got out, I felt like I could finally do what I wanted to do. And here's the thing. I've got people telling me on a very regular basis that I basically just don't really know what I'm doing, that I don't create good art, that I have no idea how to do certain things, that my process is less because I don't do certain things in Photoshop and whatever. And so I think that all you need to do is get out of school if that's holding you back, or take every challenge that you have in school with the greatest possible creativity and just promote your vision. And once you do that, the rest is going to come, because you will develop a sense of what looks good and what doesn't look good, and people will agree with you. Okay. So I've got a question about soft proofing my work, which, to be honest, I just heard that word for the first time like a week ago. So the answer is no, because I know nothing about this stuff. It's terrible. I know it is, but I just know so little about all of that. So so I don't do that. And as far as color space, I think it's sRGB. Is that even the right answer? Oh my gosh, don't hate me. Okay, well, anyways, moving on. Okay, do you do these adjustments in RAW? Yes, sometimes, very rarely. So when I'm working in RAW, it's only because I've essentially messed up a shoot. And when I say messed up a shoot, I mean I shot it way too dark. I can't see detail in the shadows, so I use Camera Raw to pull up the shadows or take down the highlights, or just something that has to be slightly adjusted. I will almost never change overall color tones in Camera Raw, but that is only because I am compositing my images, so I need each image to match. Occasionally, I will import all the images that will be composited together into Camera Raw and make an overall color change. So, so that's something that I do from time to time, but Very rarely. Okay. What kind and size of monitor for photo processing do you use? For me, honestly, it's a couple different things. Right now, I'm on a big Mac, and I'm not really a Mac advocate, I would say. Like, I think they're great. I think that any computer is great. So when I'm traveling, I use a tiny little Lenovo PC, and I edit on that, but I always check my images on 3 devices. So before I publish anything, I check to see how my image looks on my Mac, on my PC, and on my phone, and that way I sort of get a sense of what other people are going to see. Okay, so I note your histograms on the tones were all very center and not full range. Do you shoot like this always? So yes, and actually great timing on that question because I was just having this conversation with my husband yesterday about histograms. And he said, are histograms supposed to look like yours do? And I said, I guess not technically, but you know, that's how I use it. So that's how it works for me. But I tend to really like my images to be very much one color. For an overall color tone, I like them to not have highlights and shadows. And this is all just goes into my personal color signature because of how I like my images to feel more like a painting where there isn't that stark black and stark white contrast. So you will see a lot of my histograms having that sort of in-between histogramminess. I'm making up words now. Oh boy. Okay, so let's see. Do you use the filters as adjustment filters, non-destructive from the layers palette, or do you always use them in the image menu? So that is correct. I use them as adjustment layers. So what this means is you guys saw me editing earlier where I was constantly going to image adjustments and then choosing something from that drop-down menu. I usually go to my adjustment layer, which is in that layers palette, and I used that once, I think, while we were going through the edit. So I'll usually use that because that means that whatever change I'm making ends up on a separate layer, which means that I don't have to worry about editing destructively, essentially. Now, there are times when I'll make a change to the actual layer, and I'm not really that worried about it because I know that I can sort of reverse it. And I'm also just not a stickler for stuff like that in my own work personally, but I do tend to use adjustment layers and I feel a little bit better about that. So the next question is why not adjustment layers? And the reason why I wasn't showing you adjustment layers is because my adjustment layers kept going off the bottom of my screen and you couldn't see what I was pushing. So I just went to image adjustments and did it sort of to the actual layer. Okay, so how did you figure out your look? I'm struggling to find my signature and end up just having a pretty image with no meaning. Well, okay, so when I was searching for my color signature, and I wish that I had an image to show you right now, like a really early picture, but you can go to my Flickr and see them. They're all there. They were all pretty much just desaturated pictures. There was no color. There was no real contrast in them. They were very, very simple like that. And the way that I started having a style was because of the subject matter that I was putting in and the way that I was composing the images. But then I realized that when I started adding color, it felt so much more authentic to what I was trying to say. So there are a few certain things that I would say to get a certain look, to find your look really. So one of them is to figure out if you have a certain way of composing your images. Now I tend to do a center composition, meaning that my subject is in the center of the frame and that there is a square frame around that subject. That's my composition that is sort of like my go-to way of composing images. I break it sometimes, but not very often. And then aside from composition, and aside from color, because I'll talk about that last. But there has to be a certain way of, I would say, either posing or propping. Okay, that's weird. So a combination of set design and the way that your character is interacting with that set can be very important if we're talking about portraiture here, and specifically the conceptual realm. So if you're thinking about images in terms of, okay, how am I going to sort of compose the image? Now, how is my subject going to interact with this image? Then that's a really great start because you're going to answer that very differently from how somebody else might answer that. And then you can move into colors. So do you have a certain type of wardrobe that you like to use, and does that sort of carry a certain color with it? Do you have a certain color background that you like to use, a certain location that has a color signature to it? And then overall colors. Do you want your images to be really dark? Do you want them to be really bright? Do you want them to have a lot of colors to them or not a lot of colors? And so it's really hard for me to say, this is how you find your color signature, this is how you find your style, but it starts with a building process. I think that people sort of go into photography expecting things to just work, you know, for every single one of those elements to just magically appear and look awesome. And that's usually not the case. We have to think of it more so in terms of, all right, I have got my background set. Now what props am I going to put in? Now that I've got my props, how is my character going to interact with those props? Now what's she going to be wearing? What time period does that reflect? Now what colors are in there, and how does that symbolically read to the viewer, and so on and so forth. Okay, hi Darcy. Okay, so do you use a color checker or gray card? Now, I do not personally. So if I were hired, let's say, by an advertising agency or something like that, then that is a situation where I might do that because that advertising agency might want me to have skin tones looking a very specific way. However, I change my color so drastically that I don't personally have a need for that because the skin tones become yellow, because the backgrounds become blue, you know what I mean? So, so I don't personally have a need, but I know a lot of people who do. Okay. Hi, Shiloh from Oklahoma City. Do you already know what color tone and signature you're going to use when going to edit a picture? Sometimes yes and sometimes no. There have been times when I've surprised myself. But that's part of my planning process because I'm just a big planner. I just absolutely love to sit down and plan something out and have a vision in my mind. I am always open to changing it, so I will almost every single time I edit a picture go drastically different with my colors just to see if there is a better option than what I had envisioned. However, most of the time I write down in my descriptions, background will be blue, subject will be yellow, dress will be red, all of these things so that I know ahead of time what vision I'm going for so then I can shoot it more purposefully. Because I do try to shoot as much in person as I can and not do it in Photoshop if I don't have to. So how do you use X-Rite? Good question. So if anybody knows me, I am the least technical person in the whole entire world, like to the point where it's actually kind of an absurd thing. And so when I use Photoshop, I'm using basic tools. And when I am going to calibrate my monitor, I need it to be extremely simple. So I actually got to go through sort of like a tutorial with my dear friend Sandra at X-Rite, and she taught me how to use the Color Monkey color checker. And so I ended up going through, I'm holding it up in my office right now, like you guys can see me, and you totally can't. But I go through and basically you just hook up the device, put it in place where it tells you to put it in place, and then within 5 minutes you're all finished doing your monitor calibration. So in the most basic terms, that's how I use it. I plug it in, I put it where it's supposed to go, and then I follow the directions. That's terrible of me, but I use it about once a month, and I just make sure that my monitor is calibrated. And the thing that shocked me the most, because I calibrated my monitor for the first time ever this year, and what shocked me is that I was looking at my images so much brighter than they actually were. And then I came to realize that a lot of my images were actually too dark, and that's why they had been printing too dark. So that was kind of a revelation for me. Okay. So how do you deal with magazines which require certain proportions? I was told once that they cannot publish my pics because it's too panoramic, for example. Yeah, isn't that a bummer when that happens? So occasionally I'll get a magazine that says I can't publish your images as squares. And in that case, I will send them options for images that I don't mind being cropped. So if, for example, somebody says, okay, I want that picture of, like the last thing that we just looked at on my screen, which was that girl on the wall, if they say, I want that picture but it can't be square, then I'm probably okay to crop that because, you know, what's on the edges isn't so important. But it would be important for me to sneak a couple images in there that are square formats and people get a sense of what my style is. Okay. So Let's see. Did I miss anything? I can't tell now because now I've lost my place, but I don't think I missed anything. Okay, so if that's it, if there are no other questions, then I think that, well, I've gone a full 34 minutes over the time, which is awful. But I had a really good time with you guys, and I am just so grateful that you guys were here, and so grateful that you tuned in, and that, you know, we can be friends and happy forever and stuff like that. But honestly, this community means the whole world to me, and I am just so happy to have your friendship. So thank you so much. And if you have any additional questions, then please feel free to write to me either via email on my website, brookeshaden.com. You can write to me on my Facebook page. You can join my group on Facebook, which is Brooke Shaden's Promoters of Passion. So you can search for that and join that, and I can answer questions there as well. But yeah, I think that's it. So yeah, great. Well, thank you guys. Have a fantastic day, and stay very, very, very inspired. Bye.